I had a very creepy friend. We'll call him Ben. I believe he might be a dangerous psychopath, or at worst, a serial killer. Ben and I met on Facebook in 2014, and he came to meet me in Romania in the summer of 2015. He seemed a little bit odd at first, but he was otherwise okay. One strange thing about him is that while he was at my house for a week, he didn't bathe for some odd reason, so he stank quite badly. So I show him around Transylvania, and we both rent an apartment in Bucharest before his departure. We hang around and he leaves. Our friendship continued online, and in 2016 I moved back to Canada. In May of that year, I fly over to Vancouver to hang out with him. Now it's important to know that this guy is a major gun nut. He collects a lot of firearms, and even claims to have briefly been in the Canadian Army. He also claims he worked as a mercenary, and was in Georgia during the Russian invasion in 2008. He claimed to have shot 2 people there, and also to suffer from PTSD. I get there, and his apartment is filthy. I'm talking trash everywhere. 2 cats that made the place stink of cat piss. The guy kept his lights on 24/7, and on his wall was a clock that played a loud tune every hour. His behavior towards me while I was there was somewhat disrespectful, but I just took it as a buddy messing around with me. He said some mildly creepy things as well, but again I brushed it off due to him being a prankster. I leave again, and our friendship continued online for some time. During this time, his conversations with me became darker and more hostile in a passive-aggressive sort of way. Ben was a hardcore alcoholic who would drink until he passed out. He does all sorts of antisocial and downright vile things while drunk. During this time, in 2016 to 2017, he said that 2 men briefly lived with him for a short while. When I pressed him about what happened to those 2 men who lived with him, he changed the subject very quickly. After what happened in 2018, when I last met up with Ben, I have a strong suspicion something bad might have happened to them. Fast forward to 2018. Me and my parents are driving to Vancouver from Calgary. Perfect time to meet up for a day or 2 with Ben. Big mistake. Ben is traveling from Kelowna to Vancouver, and we meet up at a bar near his house. We have a few drinks, and he goes home for the night. The next day we meet up, and his behavior towards me is disrespectful in a passive-aggressive way, and he's acting extremely creepy. We go to his workplace. He's very subtly disrespectful to everyone there. He's putting me on the spot a lot, and trying to make me look stupid to everyone around. He was a supervisor, so most of the people underneath him were too complacent or afraid to say anything. The man was obviously a psychopath. This is where it gets to a point where I believe my life was in danger. We decide to go back to his place. He's drinking beer and I'm rolling a joint. A movie is playing and Ben is getting quite tipsy. He's basically now adopted a speech pattern in our conversation, where I feel as though I'm being interrogated and toyed with. He's playing a video game on his computer, while I'm watching the movie. By this time I was feeling very uneasy. My gut instinct was telling me to leave. Generally speaking, you should always listen to your gut instinct. That primal thing inside of you linked to fight or flight is best to be obeyed. Now as the day progressed and Ben was becoming progressively more drunk, he started saying some very weird things. He was mumbling to himself, "I don't care for anyone but myself. I don't give a shit about people." There was a loaded shotgun besides the table. He looked at his computer screen and started mumbling about being a madman with a gun. A few minutes later, he turns to me and says, "Hey, what if I put some MDMA in your drink?" I'm just kidding. The cat and mouse game continued. He's now telling me about knowing a guy who's HIV positive, and how he was going to get the man to give him an infected needle to infect himself with HIV, so he could live with government benefits for the rest of his life. I was starting to see that this guy was unhinged. I was sitting there in disbelief at just how vile he was being. I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want him to know I was ready to go. It's an awful, vulnerable feeling. He has another beer and turns to me. I'm now very uncomfortable. The talk is now about food. He turns to me and looks me straight in the eyes. So if this was your last meal, what would you have? The look on his face was one of stone-faced sincerity and malice. I knew I had to flee. My heart was pounding. I needed to make a move. With adrenaline rushing through my body, I tell Ben in a very calm manner that the weed I had is making me feel funny, and I need a breath of fresh air. I quickly put on my shoes and left before he had any chance to stop me. He makes me promise I'll come back. I go down the stairs and into the sunlight, and suddenly I feel like an animal that's just escaped the slaughter. The place I'm staying at is not too far from Ben's house. Luckily, I was wise enough to not tell him where I was staying at exactly. I start walking. The phone rings. Ben is asking where I'm at, and that he's panicking. I tell him I'm still taking a breather. Meanwhile, I get to my cousin's house. I somehow manage to get inside. Night has fallen. The guy was calling my phone constantly. Whenever I answer, he's trying to get me to meet up with him and go for a ride, but the tone of his voice is flat and fake. He just keeps saying, "We just had a bad night." He was desperately trying to get me to go for a ride with him. I blocked his number. I blocked him on social media. That was the last time I ever spoke to the scumbag. In our many online conversations over the years, Ben would drop clues here and there about his past, that he did horrible things during his supposed gig as a mercenary. He would go on drunken tirades about being a bad man who's done bad things. He was going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and trying to put on a facade of normality by volunteering at an old folks' home. Deep down, I think he's a psychopath, a potentially dangerous one at that. I just hope he never hurt anyone other than the 2 people he allegedly shot while on combat duty. Vancouver is a sketchy place full of missing people, so I guess we'll never know. This story happened to me and my girlfriend, now fiancé. And to give you some context, she and I met online in 2015 and fell in love. We communicated via Skype for 3 years because we lived in separate countries, until I came to live with her in February of 2018. So a few weeks or so before I flew out to meet her, she had made friends with a group of guys in her hometown. I got to meet them shortly after living with her. They ranged in age from 16 to 18, and they would come over to visit us very often because we lived quite close to the high school they attended. At first, I found it to be a bit weird that they would always come over and take up so much of our time, but they actually turned out to be really good friends over time. One of them even agreed to be one of my groomsmen recently. Back then, though, there was one in particular that always bugged me: Dan. As I mentioned earlier, the guys would come and visit and hang out with us quite a lot, but Dan was the one who would always take up the most of our time. I say this in the sense that he would message us early almost every day, asking if we were home and if he could come over. He would proceed to spend almost the entire day from morning to night, or early afternoon to night depending on his work schedule, crashing at our place. He would also go out of his way to meet us, and he bumped into us wherever we went, whether it was in the store, a coffee shop, or any other place you could possibly think of. While I found this annoying, there wasn't anything particularly creepy or weird going on yet. Mind you, we live in a small town, where it's almost impossible to not run into someone you know on the way to buy groceries or something like that. Plus, I had only known him for about as long as my fiancé had known him. That wasn't a very long time at all, so I thought that maybe I was judging him too harshly at a first glance. Also, he was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from another country, who he was hoping to meet in real life just like me. So I felt like I could at least relate to him in that aspect of our lives. I decided to let it all slide, but I made a note to keep an eye out for any suspicious behavior. The problem seemed to start once he also started trying to incorporate himself into other aspects of our life. He would make friends with anyone we'd been friends with for a long time. He would tag along with us whenever we were going to meet up with said friends, even though he was never invited. He'd hang out with them without us knowing. My favorite instance, and the one that made me become more suspicious of him, was one time when we were getting ready to hang out with some longtime friends of my fiancée. As the friend had finished her shift, we were getting ready to get into her car and drive over to her place. Dan suddenly shows up out of nowhere and joins us uninvited. It was just so off-putting that he would just invite himself over without our friends or even our permission. Then, when we were done there and walking home, the three of us passed by his house. Me and my fiancée lived further away at the time. We assumed he'd just go home, but nope. He kept tagging along with us, with the excuse that he needed to buy something at the store. It was bullshit since all the stores had been closed for over an hour, and he knew it well. So he kept walking with us, until at one point when we were almost home, we put our foot down and told him that we were tired and just wanted to go to sleep as soon as we got home. We had to tell him to go home by himself. It took us a whole 10 minutes to convince him, during which he would react to our requests with awkward and creepy silences. He finally headed home, very annoyed. My fiancée, concerned she'd offended him, asked if he wanted to hang out with us later that week. What followed was various weeks of him coming over to our place, staying until late at night, and him slowly leaving more and more of his stuff at our place, so he'd have an excuse to always come over. I shit you not, he even brought over his PS3 with a bag of 30 or so games which stayed there for 3 months. It got to the point where people thought he'd moved in with us, hence the title. He also seemed to have problems with all of our friends. Among other things, he would get into arguments with our friends, and told one friend who was goofing around at our place that he'd kill him if he didn't shut up. He lied to us, and made us believe that 2 good friends of ours wanted to report us to the police for drugging our friends. I mentioned earlier that some of them were 16 at the time. He allegedly hit one of our friends' girlfriends once. This was never confirmed, but I have no reason to believe it's a lie. It was like he wanted us all to himself, and he was trying his best to isolate us from our friends. The last thing he did, which ended up being the key to us getting rid of him forever, was that he started dating my fiancé's cousin, MJ. He broke up with his long-distance girlfriend under suspicious circumstances, and started dating her. As a result, whenever MJ came to visit, Dan would come along as well. My fiancé wanted to hang out with MJ. There was Dan. Even when he was dating someone else, his obsession with us never ended. One day, when we were in town, we met another friend of ours, and Dan insisted that we hang out with that guy all day, when we'd already agreed to do something else. When we refused, he and MJ ditched us to be with him, and that was when we'd had enough. We got into a huge fight later that day in the park, with some of our friends as witnesses, and told him off. We told him we didn't want anything to do with him anymore, and to pack up his shit and never show his face at our place again. This unfortunately resulted in my fiancé and MJ not talking to each other for a long time. We had to move a few times since then, the most recent being February of last year. We never saw him in person and blocked him on all our social media. We basically blocked him out of our lives. We know from our friends, though, that he's tried many times to find out where we live. Our friends always have our backs, though, and they never tell him. MJ and my fiancé recently made up after she dumped him, and now that the sour taste he left behind is for the most part gone, it goes without saying that we never want to see him again. I realize there are a lot of questions or gaps to fill in, so I'll try my best to fill them in here. People have asked if he had parents or what his home life was like, and if this might have affected the behavior. He did have parents, but I have no idea what his home life was like. All I know from friends and hearsay is that he apparently had very violent tendencies. His family had to move from his hometown in the past because he'd been accused of allegedly raping a teenage girl. I don't know if that's true or not, but considering what we've discussed here, I definitely wouldn't rule it out. He can also be very manipulative. He tried to use people to get what he wants. He was 18 when we first met him, and should be about 20 by now. 2. Some people have considered the possibility that he might have fallen in love or been obsessed with my girlfriend. While I wouldn't rule it out, it was after talking to my fiance's cousin that we figured out another possible explanation. Dan loves to talk about cars, and he'd found out that my father-in-law likes to collect vintage cars. He'd recently gotten his hands on a vintage highway patrol police car. As I mentioned, he tries to use people to get what he wants. I guess he figured if he could get along with us well enough, he'd have a chance to ride shotgun with him, or even get the car. There was no chance that would happen, though. I grew up in the Midwest. About 10 years ago, I moved to a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, where I work for a company that runs cabin rentals and a water taxi service, transporting campers and hunters, sometimes freight, to various locations, and sometimes just 20 minutes away, sometimes hours away. During the winter, a few years ago, we had a couple staying in one of our very basic cabins, the kind of cabin you'd stay in at summer camp. My understanding was the guy, Dick, was taking a class at the trade school in town, so he'd be gone all day while the woman, Jane, stayed at the cabin with their 3 dogs. We never saw her outside while he was away. One day, Jane burst into the office in tears, hysterical. She told us that Dick had been beating her for days, starving her, that he'd been locking her in the cabin while he was away, and even threatened her with his dogs. We immediately called the police to the office, and while we waited for them to arrive, she told us the details of their relationship. Jane was from South Africa and came from a quite wealthy family. Her father had recently passed away, so she'd received quite a large inheritance. She met Dick on social media, and he sold her on this bogus dream of building a remote lodge. He'd even convinced her to transfer all this money she'd just inherited to his bank account. He spent it on a remote piece of property, a new truck, and a boat, among other things. Jane was totally at Dick's mercy. She voluntarily transferred the money to him. It was evident that she'd grown up wealthy, and she didn't seem to have any idea how to take care of herself. By the time the police arrived, she'd reversed her story. She wouldn't tell them he'd hit her, threatened her, or locked her in the cabin. I walked over to the cabin with the officer to talk to Dick, but of course he denied everything. The cop was very visibly frustrated. It was clear to him that Dick was mistreating her, but he didn't have enough to go off of to make an arrest. I told Dick he needed to leave the property anyway. I didn't want him there, and the woman didn't want to go with him. Jane had managed to get in touch with a friend in the US who bought her a plane ticket, and another employee and I had offered to drive her to the airport in the city, about 200 miles away that very night. Dick left without issue. The last thing I said to him was, "Don't come back." I told him if I ever saw his truck in our area again, I would assume he was there to cause trouble and would call the police without any hesitation. I felt terrible for the woman. She'd made a very bad investment and had no hope of ever recovering any of that money. Months passed. It was well into the summer, and I'd all but forgotten about this incident. I'd heard that Jane had gone back to Dick and that they were in town from another water taxi operator. He'd been transporting them to and from their remote property, because Dick had wrecked the boat he bought with Jane's money on the rocky beach. One day I answered a phone call from a very distraught woman from the other side of the country. She was desperately trying to find her son, who had answered an ad Dick had posted online. He was looking for help doing construction at this remote property. She'd just been calling water taxi operators in the area, asking if anyone knew this guy Dick. Apparently, her son Mike had called her from a satellite phone out at the property, and he'd told her he was in danger. They weren't getting along, and Dick finally ran him off. This property was out in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by sea or air, no roads at all. You can't just tell someone to leave. Where would they go? Mike's mother relayed to me that Dick wouldn't let him sleep in the cabin. He wouldn't share food. He'd even chased him out with a rifle when he realized Mike had the sat phone. It was lucky he'd managed to get the call out. Mike's mother called with the intention of hiring us to go pick up her son. I told her, "Miss, this is an emergency. You need to contact the police." I contacted the state police and the Coast Guard immediately. They jointly dispatched a boat and a helicopter to the area to rescue this man. Mike was rescued safely, and Dick was arrested. Jane was there too, but refused to come back with the police. She stayed at the cabin. Mike came out to the office a few days later to meet with me. He gave me a big hug and thanked me. He was convinced I'd saved his life. It was a nice sentiment, but in my opinion, the police and the Coast Guard were the ones who did all the work. He told me some more details of his experience. Dick had actually taken several shots at him while chasing him through the woods. He told me that when Dick caught up to him, he held him at gunpoint, ordered him to strip naked, and locked him in a shipping container that he had on the property. He was convinced he was going to die. He was still locked in the container when the state police arrived. Mike didn't stay for long, but I was impressed that he took the time to come out and introduce himself. I wished him luck. Dick was charged with attempted murder, but I believe those charges were ultimately dropped. Mike ended up with a hefty settlement, probably from that inheritance money Dick had swindled from Jane. I received a phone call later that summer from a reporter in the city, asking about what had happened. Mike's mother had given him my information. I agreed to tell him what I knew, on the condition that he not mention my name or the name of the company I work for, which of course he did anyway. The story is available online, and I might be willing to share the link privately if anyone is interested, as long as it stays private. The other night I was having a few beers with my neighbor Al, a young guy who moved to town last year. This story popped into my head, and when I mentioned Dick's name he perked up. Apparently they worked together at the shipyard. I can't believe it. This motherfucker is back in town, without Jane this time, working a minimum wage job. So Dick, you Lord of the Flies psychopath, let's not meet. This happened about 9 years ago. I was living with a roommate at the time, in a townhouse in a suburb of Denver. My boyfriend at the time had always been kind of abusive, the occasional slap or pinning me down to the floor, but after a family member that he was close to committed suicide, he really lost it. My ex, Pierce, just lost it in the middle of an argument one day, about a week after the funeral. He threw me to the ground, punching my arm over and over, until there was a giant bruise on one shoulder and a handprint-shaped bruise on the other. My face also ended up being swollen, and I had a bloody lip. My roommate called the police, and he ended up being arrested. A no-contact order was put in place. He was also ordered to go to counseling, and maybe drug or alcohol meetings, even though at the time he didn't use. Fast forward a few months. I'm living with this roommate. Because I was completely financially dependent on him, she's taken it upon herself to pay for me to get my GED. That woman is a saint. I just needed to throw that out there. A lot of my time was spent on studying for the subjects. After everything, I was very agoraphobic, but I even managed to forge some online friendships, and maybe even something more with a genuinely kind man. One day, Pierce's grandmother stopped by to take me to pay my phone bill. She lived close by in the same townhouse complex and was more or less right behind where I lived. I remember it being the first beautiful and slightly warm day after a long winter, so I opened all the blinds to let the sunlight in. I left them open when I left. After paying my phone bill, Pierce started calling her. I wasn't too concerned, because I knew that he was supposed to be at his court-mandated counseling shortly. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his grandmother told him that we had just stopped at a McDonald's. Again, not an issue at this point. I continued to eat my Big Mac or whatever, until maybe 3 minutes later Pierce calls again. His grandma tells him that she's probably going to be home in about 10 minutes. The call ends. I finish my food and leave. Again, in the car, as I'm maybe 2 minutes away from where I live, Pierce calls again. I still can't hear his side of the conversation, but his grandma tells him the intersection we just passed. Suddenly, I have this terrible sinking feeling in my stomach. I know something is wrong. I can't identify what, but I know in my heart of hearts that something is very wrong here. I considered asking his grandma for help, but for context, his grandmother, on multiple occasions, watched Pierce hit me or try to strangle me. She would openly express disgust at how I can't help but piss him off. This same lady knew that her daughter, Pierce's mother, broke Pierce's nose when he was 6 because he saw his mother flip someone off and copied her, did nothing to intervene or let him know that wasn't okay. The family member Pierce was mourning for often told him he was a fuck-up and was probably the most verbally and emotionally abusive person I've ever witnessed in real life, or any movie or book or whatever. So this family was just super fucked up. And to other people, to each other, I was completely alone in this situation. Anyway, his grandma pulls in front of where I live. I noticed that all of the blinds I had opened were now closed. We go inside. When she leaves, I walk upstairs to my room. I see a random Word document open on my computer. Pierce had written a whole page worth of shit. I only paid attention to the big words at the top, though. I read your emails. Immediately, I know that he's seen the emails between me and the guy I'd met. Even though they weren't outright sexual or flirty, you could kind of tell there was something there. My brain stopped reading at this point, and I need to figure out if he's still in this building. Because there's a no contact order, I know he would have come in through the back door, so nobody would see him. My mind latches onto this idea that if the back door is locked, he's probably gone. I run downstairs to the door, and I see that it's locked. As soon as I reach the door, though, I hear a closet sliding open from the room I was just in, loud and angry footsteps, and he's yelling my name. I know that this may sound weird, but I can't recall exact events. I remember his face in mind before I could understand what was happening. I remember being back up in that room again. I think to go through all of my emails with him. I remember him slapping me hard in the face, one and over until I got dizzy. I remember somehow convincing him to let me use my phone to respond to one of my roommate's texts. I don't remember what I said, but I remember that she called me right away. I remember Pierce standing 2 feet away from me and looking at me, believing he was going to kill me. I remember her asking me, "Are you safe?" I only said no. She told me that she was on her way and would be there as fast as she could. Eventually, Pierce became convinced I had called the police, and with a knife in his hands told me that if they were coming, that he might as well give me what I deserve. I managed to convince him that I didn't call the police, and then he started crying about what a terrible person he was. He threatened to kill himself with that knife. So with a handprint on my swollen face, I tried to convince him that he wasn't terrible, and to please not kill himself until my roommate came home. Insane ex-boyfriend. I moved states, had my name changed, and only feel safe in buildings in big cities where I'm at least 3 stories up. Let's never meet again. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. I got a big update for you guys today. It seems like the Teespring store is finally online, so if everything's going well, you should probably be able to see all of the new merchandise on the merchandise shelf below the video. I got some mugs, I got some phone cases, and I got some t-shirts for y'all with the designs on them. All of the shirt designs are under one thing, so if you click on the sweatshirts, it should take you to a page where you can order a different variety of different kinds of shirts. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that. Let me know what you guys think, if it looks good, the pricing, everything. So look forward to that. As always, if you guys liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have a story that you'd like me to read, or you have a story that you'd like to send in yourself, please be sure to check the description of the video below, as it contains all of the links to my social media, including my Facebook, Twitter, Gmail, and Twitch accounts. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is, how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in, and what type of story it is, if it does have a type. Also, if you decide to send in a story, please be sure to properly format it into separate paragraphs. Thank you guys very much for that. If you guys are curious about the music used at all in this video, it's all listed in the description below, in the order of which it appears in, with links to all of the artists as well. So if you enjoy their work, please be sure to check it out and support them. Speaking of artists, as always, my friend Alan is doing the thumbnails for the videos now, so I have links to all of his art pages in the description as well. So if you like his art and you appreciate it a lot, please be sure to check out his pages and go support him, because he does some really great stuff. I think that's all for today, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.